Aita for telling people about my toxic friend after she hit me. I am a 16-year-old female who had a best friend, whom I will refer to as Amelia, almost 17 years old, for 7 years. We were incredibly close and shared everything, especially during the pandemic when neither of us interacted with many other people. Everything seemed fine, and we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. However, Amelia began to get angry with me over trivial issues. She would become upset if she thought I copied a song idea. Both of us write song lyrics, even though it was a very popular one I had come across while listening to music. She would also get frustrated if I took longer than a day to respond to messages, despite the fact that she often took longer to reply as well. She had a phone, while I did not, so I wasn't always aware of new messages, and she was aware of this. Additionally, she would get irked if I didn't constantly engage in conversation with her at school, even though I was always the one starting our chats and having to steer them with topics. She typically gave short replies that left the conversation stagnant unless I kept adding to it. She would be annoyed if I partnered with someone else on a school project, despite frequently leaving me out. On one occasion, I borrowed her hairbrush because she frequently took my belongings, and she yelled at me for almost half an hour. There were many similar incidents. I would constantly try to explain my perspective, only to receive lengthy, angry messages from her outlining why I was a bad friend. Eventually, I would concede and promise to improve for future interactions, at which point she would offer a half-hearted apology, typically just saying, "I'm sorry I got mad." Things would be okay for a while, but then she would explode at me again. After some time, she stopped informing me of what I was doing wrong. I was left bewildered, as I had essentially ceased talking to other friends and dedicated all my time to her, engaging with her and forcing conversations. She told me that if I did not understand what I had done wrong, it meant I was a terrible friend and that it was my fault, among other comments. I found myself apologizing more than she warranted, and while things would be all right for a time, she suddenly began discussing this one friend of hers, whom I will refer to as Opal, 18 years old. Apparently, Opal and Amelia had been friends since childhood and were extremely close. It's important to note that Amelia had never mentioned Opal to me prior to this. They are real. I have since met them, and soon, it seemed Opal was all Amelia could talk about. Amelia is aromantic and asexual, so that was not the motivation behind her sudden fixation. When I finally expressed that it made me somewhat uncomfortable that all she discussed was Opal, she snapped at me, claiming she was tired of hiding such a significant aspect of her life from me. I decided to give in, not wanting to instigate yet another argument. Amelia met Opal about once a month, and they would stay at each other's houses since they lived quite a distance apart. The day after every time they spent together, I would receive one of the longest texts from Amelia, detailing all of my perceived flaws. She would assert that her conversation with Opal had opened her eyes to my shortcomings. Essentially, Amelia had informed Opal of every tiny mistake I had ever made, and from her biased perspective. She always concluded such messages by proclaiming that I was making her feel depressed and that we could no longer be friends. In my foolishness, I tried to apologize, particularly because she would include a line about still caring for me amidst her criticisms. I would let myself endure treatment I did not deserve, and then she would forgive me, albeit with conditions and a detailed plan for how I could improve. It's worth mentioning that Amelia was not in a healthy mental state. She appeared to be quite depressed and only confided in me and Opal about it. I encouraged her to seek therapy, partly because I recognized I was not equipped to assist her and partly because my own mental health was suffering, exacerbated by her behavior. I could not manage her late-night texts filled with depressive rants anymore. In contrast, Opal advised Amelia against therapy, arguing that it only makes matters worse, claiming that therapists take your information and use it against individuals later in life regarding job opportunities. Guess who Amelia chose to listen to? Opal. I had glimpsed their exchanges while they were searching for a picture to share with me, and they bore no resemblance to the messages Amelia sent me. While I only saw the last few days of their discussions, I was inundated with Amelia's depressive texts daily, if not multiple times per day. As I mentioned earlier, my mental health was also poor, and I often went to bed in tears because of Amelia. Yet, she never checked in on me. I felt this was another crucial aspect to note. So, this situation persisted until one day when we were hanging out together, attempting to decide which game to play, and I suggested one. She dismissed it as stupid and stated she did not want to play it. When I inquired which game she wished to play, she instructed me to choose. Hence, I selected a different one that I knew she usually enjoyed. She then insulted me, calling me a pathetic excuse for a human being, let alone a friend, and struck my head with the game controller. It hurt considerably and left me with a bruise that lasted the following week, concealed beneath my winter hat. I carried on as if nothing had happened for the remainder of our time together that day. Following that incident, I began to distance myself from Amelia. However, I had lost nearly all of my other friends while trying to maintain my connection with Amelia, and I felt compelled to either spend more time with her at school or be viewed as the outcast. Amelia is rather popular, while I am often seen as the quirky trans theater kid. I attempted to avoid spending time with her alone, but school assignments occasionally required it. She began to hit me more frequently, using random objects or just her hands. The worst incident occurred when she brandished a knife and threw it at me. Somehow, I managed to move aside and it missed me. I left her house immediately after that, claiming I felt nauseous, which was partly true as I was genuinely in shock. Ultimately, I resolved to cut off all contact with her. I still see her at school, but I blocked her on every platform. It took 5 months of being alone before I participated in a school musical, where I made new friends. We've been friends for a significant amount of time now, and they are so much better than my friendship with Amelia. The bar was set low, to be honest, but I consider them some of the best friends I could have wished for, regardless of the circumstances. I also have a partner now, and we've been together for 3 months. My life has improved significantly, and I felt ready to share my experiences related to Amelia, so I confided in my new friend Lee, 16 years old, and my partner Danny, non-binary, 15 years old. Both are pseudonyms. They were both shocked yet supportive, and it felt liberating to share my story. I decided to omit the physical abuse as I was not prepared to discuss that aspect. However, I am baffled at how Amelia discovered that I confided in them. I suspect it was another cast member who is a friend of hers and was nearby when I spoke to Lee and Danny, yet I cannot be certain. And to clarify, I genuinely trust Lee and Danny. They would never disclose anything unless I expressly asked them. Amelia confronted me after school last Friday, shouting at me. She demanded to know how I could share lies about her, insisting that it would tarnish her reputation. I replied that her reputation would not be affected if she hadn't done those things, and pointed out that she had created this situation for herself. She shoved me against a wall and slapped my face before proceeding to spit on me. Yes, that is not a typographical error. She actually spat on me and hurled every slur she could think of at me. I am also autistic, so she had a wide range of insults to choose from. I acknowledge that I may be presenting this in a lighthearted manner, and I apologize if that offends anyone. I am merely trying to process the events that transpired. She then left, which I was grateful for, and I went home. We do not have school this week, so thankfully I have not had to see her, and I am uncertain how I will handle it when I do. Now, this is where it shifts into an "am I the asshole" scenario. I apologize for the lengthy background. I confided in some other friends about what happened, and they are siding with Amelia. They claim that I must have done something terribly wrong to provoke her in such a manner, and the fact that I do not know what I did makes me a terrible individual. I even informed them about the abuse I endured, yet they continue to side with Amelia. I am thoroughly confused. They argue that it is not abuse, and that I am unfairly appropriating a term reserved for those who have undergone severe trauma. They assert that my accusations could lead to serious legal repercussions for her, and that it is not just to put her in such a position. Am I the one in the wrong? Is this abuse, or am I merely overreacting? Is this a common occurrence, and am I simply struggling to cope? Any advice would be greatly appreciated. Story 2. After finding out I'm pregnant, my partner came home at 4 a.m., drunk, waking me up, and said I should abort that shit. I, 37F, and my partner, 45M, have been in a relationship for 10 years. A few years ago, I relocated from Europe to the United Kingdom for him. Not a single day goes by without me longing for my home and family. However, for a significant period, we were content, We became engaged, purchased a house, and both hold full-time positions. He has 2 children, an adult and a teenager, from 2 previous relationships. I recently discovered that I am expecting a child, still very early in the pregnancy, and I have no other children, but our relationship feels stagnant, and I have certainly undergone changes. I have become more irritable, less tolerant, more anxious, and resentful. I find myself contemplating life frequently, worrying excessively about various aspects, including the current condition of the world. My mental burden is consistently heavy. I tend to overthink and analyze situations. He, being somewhat my opposite, is likely affected by my demeanor and may be experiencing unhappiness as a result. I will refrain from detailing every issue, but it suffices to say that our relationship has grown cold and distant. This pregnancy, which we attempted to achieve on and off for years, now feels like the worst possible timing. In the beginning of our relationship, we enjoyed going out together when I was perceived as fun, but now I have settled into a routine and rarely go out anymore. I have very few friends here in the UK because most social activities seem to involve drinking, which has never appealed to me. I have never been drunk, and I feel uneasy in the company of intoxicated individuals as they can be unpredictable and stressful. Additionally, my sensitive nature, coupled with my introverted personality, means I prefer solitude and reading books. At times, we play video games together since he is a gamer. I wasn't interested in gaming until I met him, and I traded my love for the outdoors for gaming because it constitutes one of the few common interests we share. Although I spend less time gaming than he does, since balancing a full-time job with household responsibilities and cooking is challenging. My partner has a history of drinking. It has not been a significant issue or noticeable enough to raise alarms until recently. While he does not drink daily, when he does indulge, he typically binge drinks and has a considerable tolerance for alcohol. I remind him that this is not something to take pride in, yet he always suffers from a hangover the following day. Over the past 2 weeks, he has gone out drinking on the weekend, once with his adult son, and subsequently on his own. He always manages to find someone to socialize with, and stayed out until the early morning hours without updating me on his well-being or when he would return home. Whenever he goes out, he insists he will only be gone for a short while, but I know this almost never turns out to be the case. During such occasions, I find myself staying up all night, anxiously wondering if he is all right and feeling upset and frustrated. It is challenging for me to express how his actions affect me without getting emotional. However, he is already aware of my feelings since we discussed this after a particularly distressing event. One of his close friends recently stayed over, and both of them drank excessively, which triggered a panic attack in me and caused me to cry. His friend also behaved disrespectfully towards me. After that incident, we attempted to establish boundaries, such as agreeing that he would never come home drunk. Instead, he should stay with a friend or in a hotel, and that he should keep me informed about his plans as a courtesy. I now avoid being around his friend and have been hesitant to allow him back into our home afterward. No one should feel uncomfortable or unsafe in their own house. His other friends drink heavily, and from what I have observed, a significant number of people in our area drink regularly, which often leaves me feeling unpopular and excluded because I am not deemed fun. I fear that this new pattern of binge drinking every week will lead to more serious issues down the line, and despite being aware of how it affects me, he does not see it as a problem. I may come across as nagging and controlling because I struggle to communicate diplomatically and non-emotionally. However, I am genuinely worried about where this behavior of binge drinking might lead in the future. Additionally, now that I am early in my pregnancy, I feel incredibly lonely and lost. He has already experienced fatherhood twice, so it is not a new experience for him, and vulnerable. I miss my family and lack a supportive network here. I perceive problems where he observes none. The last situation I need is for things to worsen, and although I want to keep the baby, having one may not be the most prudent choice at this moment. It has been an arduous journey to conceive, and now I face a difficult decision. I am seeking advice as I feel overwhelmed and lost. Is there a way forward? In summary, my 37F partner, 45M, has developed a habit of staying out drinking all night until the early hours. I discovered my pregnancy a month ago, and I am genuinely concerned about our future. Later edit, thank you to everyone for your support and advice. He returned home around 4 a.m., intoxicated, and woke me up, which caused me to feel very anxious and frightened due to the previous incident. I experienced a panic attack, cried, and shook uncontrollably, pleading with him to go to sleep since I struggle to communicate with him when he is intoxicated. He declined and instead allowed all his resentment to surface in what became predominantly a monologue, as I was too shocked and panicked to engage in a conversation. He holds resentment towards me for being controlling, dislikes our pets, and feels anger towards me for voicing complaints after a challenging day at work. Yes, I have changed, and I am not the cheerful person I once was. I sacrificed a great deal for this relationship. I acknowledge that I am imperfect and can be challenging to deal with. He claimed that I always dismiss his feelings and never consider his wants and needs, and he insists that he sees no issue with going out, getting drunk, and enjoying himself. I tried to remind him that he broke a promise to refrain from coming home intoxicated after the incident with his friend, and he responded by questioning why I would ever expect him to keep such a promise, stating that he is British and they enjoy drinking, insisting that he will not allow me to change him. He accuses me of driving his friends away. One friend ceased communication after he had to move following our decision to live together. Another friend became drunk at our place and threw a glass at me, barely missing my head, and another best friend disrespected me while drunk at our house. He attempted to make a new friend at the local pub, but that individual, whom I hardly knew, became intoxicated at our home. All the friends he blames me for driving away have, in one way or another, disrespected me. He also stated that crying women cannot command respect while I was having a breakdown in front of him. He suggested that I should feel fortunate that he was merely having fun down the street at the local pub, as it could have been worse. He could have gone into town and hooked up with other women. He remarked that I am a tough nut to crack and that he will eventually find a way to break me. He announced that he would take charge around the house and run it like a dictatorship, where he would be at the top of the hierarchy and would never again be instructed on what to do. He told me I should abort that situation, which in retrospect were perhaps the most hurtful words he has ever uttered to me. This shattered my world, and I completely shut down, not speaking another word to him. I have documented most of our conversation and the painful things he said to me. He is currently asleep upstairs, and I feel shattered, hurt, and fearful about having to speak to him again in a few hours. Story 3. Grandpa turned a barn into a mechanic's shop, and after a lawsuit battle, he transformed the local dealership's competition. OMG, Hammer Automobile Sparkles. Many individuals appreciate this narrative, so I made the decision to establish a subreddit focused on sharing tales about grandmothers and grandfathers. Feel free to contribute your story. https www.reddit.com. Nana and Papa, my grandfather, was quite accomplished, and upon reaching his mid-60s, he decided it was time to slow down, leading him to sell his various businesses. He sold them off and spent the subsequent years traveling. As his 70th birthday drew near, he found himself feeling restless, especially after welcoming a few new grandchildren, prompting his need for a larger home. He sold the house he had purchased after returning from Vietnam and acquired a substantial residence on an expansive plot of land. This new property included a considerable steel barn. Uncertain whether he had shared his intentions with anyone, shortly after acquiring the property, he invested a significant amount of money into tools and equipment, transforming his barn into a mechanic's paradise. Some items I recall include a professional car lift capable of raising full-size trucks, professional oil catchers typically seen at quick lubes, a dedicated air compressor system designed to power all of his electric tools, a tire machine for mounting new tires, an abundance of equipment. His tool corner occupied a substantial section of this large barn. What was his objective? To repair vehicles, particularly for individuals in need. Residing in a rural area, not having access to a car posed a significant challenge. He informed everyone at his local church that he was willing to repair their vehicles provided they supplied the necessary parts. He limited himself to just a few jobs weekly, undertaking this work for his enjoyment and to assist those who required it. He routinely performed oil changes, transmission fluid replacements, and various repair tasks. My grandfather was a skilled mechanic. However, he kept the workload manageable and was selective. If someone truly needed help, he was eager to assist. If a person could afford to pay, he would decline and suggest they seek assistance elsewhere. One day, the owner of the local car dealership approached my grandfather, insisting that he cease fixing other people's vehicles because he lacked proper licensing, did not carry the necessary insurance, and was undermining his business. My grandfather clarified that this was purely a hobby and that he only worked on a few cars each week. The dealership owner demanded he stop or face legal action. My grandfather found this amusing and wondered how the dealership owner intended to sue him out of business. After the owner left, my grandfather received legal papers. He was being sued by the car dealership owner. Determined to reason with him, my grandfather decided to visit the dealership in hopes of reaching a mutual understanding. During their conversation, my grandfather explained that he only repaired vehicles for individuals who were struggling. The reality was that the cars he worked on likely belonged to those who could not afford to pay a professional dealership. He limited his work to a few cars weekly. He had no desire to engage in conflict over his hobby, but he was unwilling to back down. Consequently, they ended up in court. At this point, my grandfather had retained a lawyer who successfully helped him obtain city approval for a commercial garage on his property. It was advantageous that he lived on the outskirts of town and owned 6 acres of land. The court informed my grandfather that his auto repair operation was illegal. If he wished to continue, he must acquire a business license, obtain the appropriate insurance, and upon doing so, he would be compliant. Now, what do you think a man with ample time and resources would do in this scenario? Naturally, he would secure his business license and insurance, which he promptly did, surprising no one. However, he took additional steps. He arranged for a dedicated phone line to be installed in his shop. He hired a full-time mechanic. He erected a professional sign. He established a small waiting area complete with a water cooler. What astonished everyone even more was that he ran a local television advertisement promoting his pay what you can mechanic shop, with reservations required. He placed advertisements in the local newspaper conveying the same message. Indeed, my grandfather became not only a licensed and legitimate auto repair business owner, but also employed a certified mechanic and actively sought customers through advertisements. As for his pricing, it was straightforward. Customers could supply the parts and pay the mechanic whatever they chose. The mechanic received a separate wage from my grandfather, so if a customer was unable to pay anything, that was perfectly acceptable. If my grandfather sourced the parts, he would charge for them, and customers would still pay the mechanic whatever they preferred. My grandfather began accepting jobs, and his shop soon became quite busy. Competing with Grandpa's prices was virtually impossible. He was essentially paying to repair cars for his customers. My grandfather cherished spending his days alongside the mechanic he had hired, working on vehicles. The owner of the local car dealership was outraged and filed another lawsuit against my grandfather. They returned to court, where the judge essentially stated that my grandfather owned a legal, insured auto repair business, and he could set his own pricing for his services, even if that meant working for free. About a year later, my grandfather received a call from a lawyer representing a prospective buyer for the local car dealership. However, the buyer wanted to meet with my grandfather first. My grandfather agreed, and when they met, the potential buyer voiced concerns about purchasing the dealership. Service is a significant profit center for dealerships, and the buyer wanted to know if my grandfather would continue operating in his current manner, as it would be impossible for a for-profit business to compete against someone providing services for free. My grandfather acknowledged that a profit-driven business would find it challenging to compete with him. They eventually reached an agreement. The new dealership owner would purchase the dealership, and my grandfather would limit himself to working on a few cars weekly, perhaps 5 to 6, only repair vehicles for those who were struggling and likely could not afford to pay a professional dealership, purchase any needed parts from the dealership, refer any work he declined to the dealership. The new dealership owner concurred with the following stipulations. The dealership must leave my grandfather alone and stay out of his business. The dealership must hire his mechanic. They shook hands, the dealership was sold, and for the subsequent 9 years, my grandfather continued to assist individuals in need, purchasing parts from the dealership when necessary. The mechanic my grandfather hired ultimately became the service manager and thrived in his role. When my grandfather turned 80, he suffered a heart attack while at his shop. Fortunately, one of his grandchildren was present, and they quickly got him to the hospital, where he made a full recovery. However, the doctor advised him that his body could no longer handle working in that garage. He subsequently closed down his shop, and for the next 3 years, he gazed out of his kitchen window at his beloved workshop, reminiscing about the joy he experienced there. He passed away at the age of 83, surrounded by friends and family. In summary, my grandfather simply wanted to repair vehicles. The local dealership grew resentful as he outperformed them and sued him. My grandfather became serious, ultimately driving them out of business, and negotiated a deal with the new dealership owner that allowed him to continue operating his services at a level that would still permit the owner to profit, provided they let him operate freely. Story 4. Husband is having unprotected sex with strangers. I would like to begin by stating the following. 1. This is my first ever Reddit post, so please be gentle and provide me with constructive feedback. 2. This will be an extensive post, as there is much to discuss. I am 29 years old, and I have been with my husband, who is 31, for a decade, and married for nearly 3 of those years. Last year, we were blessed with a son who will be turning 1 next month. When we initially met in 2015, he was 20 and I was 19. He had just left the military, and I was a sophomore in college. Since we met on Tinder, it was evident that, while he was interested in me, he was simultaneously conversing with other women. A couple of months after we began to meet, we gradually started dating and spending time together, although we never officially labeled our relationship as boyfriend and girlfriend. About 4 months in, the first red flag appeared. He fell asleep on my bed with a Facebook message thread open, and the woman he was conversing with shared my exact name. I noticed he was calling her the same nicknames he used for me. In hindsight, that was the moment I should have walked away, but I was a smitten 19-year-old who was falling in love. By the summer of 2015, we decided to part ways and did not communicate for nearly 3 months. At that point, I believed we were finished, but naturally, around the holidays, I reached out and discovered he was homeless and struggling. I welcomed him into my college apartment, and we ended up living together for the next 7 years before we eventually became engaged and married. During my final 2 years in college, 2015-2017, I was the primary financial provider. By the time I graduated in 2017, my husband still did not have a job, and we were preparing to relocate. In 2018, he finally enrolled in a college-to-career program designed to assist military veterans in transitioning to civilian life. Throughout the 7 years we dated, from 2015 to 2021, before our engagement, there was not a single year in which he did not cheat on me, often in deeply humiliating ways. He formed emotional bonds with multiple women on dating apps and met with a couple of them for sexual encounters. In 2017, I accompanied him on a trip out of state to attend his father's funeral. On the second day of the trip, I fell victim to food poisoning and was confined to his childhood bedroom all day, suffering from vomiting and diarrhea, while he went to meet with his high school sweetheart to talk. The pain of that experience was excruciating, and I still find it hard to comprehend how we endured that moment. In 2018, he started a side relationship with a classmate in his college program, whom I confronted. Nonetheless, I chose to remain with him. In 2019, he began exploring his sexuality and arranged to meet with a locally known drag queen for sex. There are numerous additional instances of infidelity, but those are among the more dramatic events. Now we find ourselves in 2025, married with 1 child, and although I am nearly a year postpartum, I am still struggling to regain my sense of self. Recently, I discovered that about 5 months ago, he began communicating with multiple women once again. This time, his interactions are on language exchange pen pal websites, AshleyMadison.com, and pornography sites like AdultFriendFinder.com. What astonishes me is that he is now paying to engage in infidelity, even though there have been numerous instances this past year where he claimed not to have the finances for necessities for our home and our child. Currently, his behavior is spiraling out of control, as he is reaching out to men and couples to propose threesomes and to engage in cuckolding. 10 days before Christmas, our son was taken to the emergency room for a cold that was affecting his breathing. That night, my husband met with a woman he found on adult friend Finder.com and had sex with her. 2 days later, I confronted him and stated my desire for a divorce. I wanted him to leave the house and began reaching out to lawyers. However, my mother, who is of African descent and a pastor, intervened and worked diligently to mediate the situation, emphasizing that this was our son's first holiday season and that we needed to remain civil for his sake. Although it was one of the most challenging and lowest moments of my life, I agreed to let him stay in our home and try to work through our issues. This week, I discovered he returned to have sex with that same woman 2 days after New Year's and also slept with another woman. What pushes me over the edge is that he did not use a condom. Additionally, he has consistently maintained several emotional relationships with women overseas through his pen pal app, one of whom resides in Brazil, whom he has constantly badmouthed me to. For months, he would spend hours on the phone or video chatting with her and even sent her flowers from the United States on her birthday. I spoke to both of these women, who, ironically, are divorced single mothers who left their husbands after enduring years of infidelity. I cannot blame them or harbor anger toward them because he used a fake name, concocted many lies about his life, and deceived them both into believing that he was single and living independently. I am sharing this lengthy post in hopes of seeking advice from anyone who has chosen to remain with a spouse who is a serial cheater, and whether there is a possibility that things can improve. We are both Christians, although I grew up in the church as a pastor's child while my husband only came to know the Lord in adulthood. Before our marriage, I kept his infidelities low profile because I was naive, in love, and genuinely wanted my family to accept him. This time, I have made his actions known to my family, his family, and some of his friends. Yet, given that we are married and now have a child, there is immense pressure to stay and attempt to resolve our issues. It is clear that my husband struggles with psychological problems and a sex pornography addiction. I would also like to mention that he is adopted and is not close or involved with either his biological or adopted family. I believe he experiences issues with identity and possibly issues related to his relationship with his mother. Last week, I told him that I could never inflict the humiliation and pain upon him that he has caused me because I possess a moral compass and integrity. He replied that he also has those values, but is currently unwell. I believe my husband is a good man and a decent father. However, he is a terrible boyfriend, spouse, and partner. I truly believe that with God's help, he can improve. Nevertheless, I am uncertain how much longer I can endure waiting for him to change.